Good evening. I'm Edgar Allan Beam, an art critic with the Portland Phoenix. Welcome to Portland Rising, a monthly magazine of art and news and opinion produced by the Portland Phoenix. Portland Rising is mostly about what's new in Portland, so it's altogether fitting and proper that tonight we have with us Mark Bessire, Executive Director of the Portland Museum of Art, who's here to talk with us about the new wing that is being constructed and about the new chapter in the life of the museum that it will usher in. Thanks for being here. Welcome,
Mark.
Thanks,
Ed.
So the Portland Museum held an international design competition to select a design team to design the $100 million expansion and unification project. The Portland Museum's jury selected a proposal by Lever Architects of Portland, Oregon, from among 4 finalists, any one of which would have made a spectacular addition to Portland. Mark, I was hoping that you could explain to us a little bit about why the museum decided to go the way of a public competition, and then what the 60,000 square feet of space that you're going to be buying is going to do for you.
Great, thank you, Ed. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the time to talk about this. It's a very exciting opportunity. You know, anytime a community, a city, or a town is building a museum, it is a big deal because there's not that many built every year, even large renovations. And so it's really important to, I think, be as transparent and public as possible. We've seen in the past that some museum buildings and extensions haven't quite been as public, and Portland and Maine loves its PMA, and we want to be sure as many people could participate in this process as possible. The last, I would say, important museum competition was for the Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., which was actually won by Sir David Adjaye. And it watching that process, though that's now 14 years ago, how successful that process was and how the community got engaged and it became a national conversation. There hasn't been one at that level since. We thought it was important to bring back that more public and transparent opportunity for our community to participate. So even before the competition was announced, we had done listening sessions with our community to get a better idea of what this community thought a museum building could be. And that really led us to a brief that created a brief that was having a new building that's not just an art museum, but a building based on the notion of what do people in our community want from their museum, and I'd say more people-centered, under the theme of Art for All. And I think what we've done through this process has had more comment and help in thinking about what a museum wants to be in this community. The competitions I keep going, but 104 applications from 20 different countries. And we eventually, through that process, got down to 4 finalists.
And Sir David Adjaye was one of them.
Sir David Adjaye, MVRDV, and as well as Toshiko Mori and a wonderful team in Lever Architects. And part of that process was to have all 4 at a public gathering, which was amazing. The architects even told us they all compete with each other, but they rarely are in the same room and rarely even get to see each other's models. But they all knew each other, but don't ever get to see each other. And they actually enjoyed being together and having that platform. But for us to have 4 of the leading architects in the world in Portland talking about museum architecture and what's possible for Portland was a real high point for our community, I think.
And tell us a little bit about the brief in terms of what you were looking for in the 60,000 square feet, which essentially doubles the amount of space that you have.
You know, I think what we found through those listening sessions was that the community talked to us about how much they thought art was so well served in our Payson building, our Lorenzo de Medici Sweat Memorial Galleries connected to the McClellan House, which is really a full block in Portland, but that there wasn't enough space for community activity. So whether it was classrooms, gathering, food, making art. And so the big feedback we got was we'd like to see more spaces where we can engage with maybe making art or being more creative in the museum itself. We also heard a lot of feedback about, food service and also more performative spaces where you could do dance, new media, which our old buildings I love don't really do that very well. So a lot of what we learned in the listening sessions went into the brief. So in the brief, you have what we now really call a maker space, which is a space where people of all ages can come in like an old-fashioned art room and make stuff. It also will have moments where it's programmed, but it'll also have moments where it's just, you could walk in with your kids, your friends, and just make something. We do need a performance space. We have a beautiful auditorium. It only holds 185 people, and the stage is so narrow, the proscenium, that you really can't do anything more than have a talk or a film. The arts are so much more broader now than they were in 1982 or 1910, that we need a space that accommodates the needs of artists, and our auditorium does not. So one of the key components is a new performance space. We also would like to see a new cafe or eating area that's a little bit more expanded than what we have right now, which really has no cooking facilities. The Payson building, people might not remember, but it was really built without a cafe, and so we had to put it in.
The cafe's in a corridor.
It's in a corridor, and the store also was a little nook. It was a book nook,
right.
And where the store is currently actually was a gallery. And it was also, interestingly, built to be free, which is an interesting concept in 1982. So makerspace, performance space, cafe, office spaces. The PMA staff right now are in all three buildings, all spread out. Contemporary office space and remote working. We are in these buildings in nooks and crannies, and we need to be thinking about how our staff, where they want to be and how they work together, so working as a team. And then one of the key components is what we call approximately an 8,000 square feet space for, imagine where we do our current traveling shows or exhibitions like Presence, Judy Lichtman-Lauder's photographs, or the American Gothic show coming up. We need a dedicated space with plugs and walls that are high enough to fit all kinds of art. When we do a show in our current space, it's 4,500 square feet. When we partner with the Denver Art Museum or the High Museum, museums larger than us, they really demand 8,000 square feet. So we either have to cut our shows by 25% or find other space in the museum to take down art to put it up. We need a dedicated traveling space for exhibitions that's committed to that. Also, when we change over our shows in our current space, which I love, art has to come through public spaces, and it's not great for our staff to have to walk through public spaces with art to get to it, and then have the main gallery closed every 4 weeks between shows in the main section of the museum.
Your big freight elevator is right in the Great Hall.
It is the elevator for everybody, which is fine if you have another elevator for everybody else.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of complicated and isn't best practices in museums. So public spaces, more open spaces, more accessible, gallery space, performance, and gathering spaces.
And the Lever Architects solution for getting all of that is is it timber mass construction?
Yeah.
And I'm told that Bowdoin has the first timber mass construction building, public building, which is their new Arctic Museum.
Yes.
But this will be a much bigger and grander. I've had people ask me, well, all that glass, how can you exhibit art in there? And I said, well, let me ask Mark.
It's a good question, and a couple of things. I'll start with the great question about mass timber. And when we talk about mass timber in context of this building, we're really talking about sustainably harvested wood. And then when that wood is sustainably harvested, how do you then create the structure so that you could build a building like ours? Or there's a 14-story mass timber building in Norway that did it just to show that you could do it. The key component really in many ways is the manufacturing of this sustainably harvested wood into CLT, cross-laminated timber,
right,
or glue lam, which is glue laminated. What we'd like to do, and what Lever is really one of the leaders in this country on, is thinking about how to champion this use of sustainable wood products and then manufacturing them into timber that can be used in a building like the Portland Museum of Art. We have a really exciting opportunity through Lever's leadership to also think about what's happening at the University of Maine, what's happening throughout the state, what's happening in the timber industry. How can we utilize a natural resource of Maine, wood, and then possibly have our museum be a beacon for the possibility of using wood, which is much more sustainable than concrete or steel, The issue we have is that in Maine, we're not really have a manufacturing base for the value-added product of CLT and glulam, which takes that harvested wood, which keeps its carbon, which is then used for building materials. The Arctic Museum, which I actually supposed to go last week, but it snowed, and I'm going to get a tour, I think, next week. We've heard a lot about, and we want to see what they've done. Apparently, the Rock Road development is also going to be using some of this.
Really? Yeah.
We've also heard there's other projects. 317 Maine, I think, has a little bit of it in it. The issue for Maine is to really make this a new industry or manufacturing base and job creation. We have to get into the value-added part of mass timber. We've got the wood, but we really can't turn that existing resource into the product for buildings yet. And we think that this building, working with Lever, could actually be part of generating a whole new manufacturing base for this product, and that our museum could literally be a beacon of the future of utilizing sustainable wood in our state for job creation and building the economy, as well as a great museum.
Well, I think from what I could see with the 4 finalists, that obviously the museum put an emphasis on sustainability and environmental sensitivity in construction. And another aspect that you put a lot of emphasis on was being cognizant of and acknowledging somehow the indigenous people of the area and the Wabanaki heritage. And that somewhat caught me by surprise, not because the museum hasn't had in the past a lot to do with the native and natural people, but the Lever Architects, I understand the arched roof is a bow to the people of the dawn and framing the sun. But tell us about what is the museum's interest in reflecting and acknowledging the Wabanaki heritage?
Well, I think it's extremely important. The museum has been working with members of the Wabanaki community to think about how museums can serve indigenous people better. Museums have not done great service to indigenous peoples traditionally. And so over time, we're trying to build relationships and trust with the community. And as we talk about, we're moving at the speed of trust, which is slow when people have been appropriated or extracted or exploited. And so we want to be sure that when we talk about working with or listening to the Wabanaki or indigenous communities, that we're doing it on their time, not our time. One of the things we put in our brief was that the architects had to come together with a team that was diverse and thinking about diversity in the widest swath, so that indigenous concerns were part of any concept around a new building. As we all know, much of the land and the conversation you hear about land acknowledgements is very important because we are on land that was not ours. And so how do we educate or become more informed about the use of land, and how moving forward can museums which have not treated indigenous cultures very well rethink their relationship or improve their relationship? So we're fortunate that a Lever team, Chris Newell, who was the previous director at the Abbey Museum, and runs the Akamat, it's a consultancy, is one of the key consultants on this project. And Chris also has consulted at the MFA and Boston, other organizations, helping museums, I would say, in this moment of reckoning of how we can improve our relationships and the display of indigenous cultures in art museums. And so Chris has helped us learn the key here is the spirit of Wabanaki culture, not the appropriation. What a lot of organizations do is appropriate imagery and say that they're doing something that's indigenous. That's also extracting symbols, icons, and cultures that are not ours, and then saying we're friends by putting them as a design on a building.
So how does
it's not enough.
How does the Lever proposal reflect the Wabanaki?
Great question. Well, one, as Chris, in the video, if you have a chance to look at it, Chris is doing actually the voiceover for the video, and he talks literally about the roof and the design of the roof, which is this slope, and the way in which, as you mentioned, people of the land, people of the dawn, that the first light comes onto this building and will be reflective. Chris has talked about that as being not appropriation, but understanding the spirit of the culture and the ways in which this building could potentially have an impact on thinking about values related to Wabanaki culture. Another one clearly is the use of wood and harvesting it sustainably. So just the very notion of thinking about how much better indigenous cultures have treated the earth, we can learn so much about utilizing natural resources. With mass timber, there's the capacity to hold the carbon in the wood and then bring it to the building so it holds the carbon, versus cutting the wood, taking it apart, and then losing its value as a sustainable material. What we want to do is this value-added opportunity where the carbon stays in the wood and then it's used in the building, and the building itself is holding that wood, even though it's no longer a tree in the forest, it's holding the value of the wood to take care of the earth. So I think even the materials and how we're thinking about materials, building the building, and the process of going slower to be sure that sustainability factors are not left behind. So again, it's not extraction, right. It's learning, slowing down the process, and listening.
And it strikes me that also just the quality of light there's going to be the tissue that unifies the Payson building, the new building, the McClellan Sweat, and I think that's one of the things that people, it's hard to get from photos and well, not photos,
it's
drawings, but that's what art's all about, is light.
I agree, and one of the great things about the Payson building, even though I think the facade I love, but can be fairly foreboding because it's a kind of a straight brick wall.
Right.
But what Harry Cobb did was create a combination of natural and indoor light, so that every day in the museum, the light shifts because there is some natural light coming through.
They have those clear stories.
Clear stories on the top. And actually, even LDM in 1910.
Which he took from, I think, the Dulwich.
The Dulwich, and also from the Lorenzo de Medici Sweat Memorial Galleries, or we fondly say LDM, from 1910, built by John Coffin Stevens, had skylights because there really wasn't, light at that time. And so that also is a wonderful use. So we want to have the new building also reflecting that notion of light. But because technology has changed, we can have more light, but also have a building that's more open and friendly. So the very structures of LDM and Payson, to a certain extent, are fairly traditional museum structures, which are a little bit more fortress-like. Mm-hmm. They're more about protecting the outside from the inside. The new building, and what we've learned from our listening sessions, is that we'd like to see a building that's more opening and welcoming. The term we're using is belonging. What's a building, if you're not a person who comes to a museum, the Payson building could be pretty tough to face, and walk in, and then you're in this big open space. What we learned is the notion of how can Lever help us think about the notion of equity in architecture. Mm-hmm. And if people are not coming to a museum, what would make a building more welcoming to someone who's not comfortable in that space? Light is one of the things that can do it, as well as a wood product, which is also more friendly and probably lighter.
Well, of the four finalists, I would have to say that the Lever proposal was the most deferential, in that the materials are soft, and the mass, the roof line is acknowledged. Things aren't standing up above. On the other hand, as you well know, from comments online and comments in newspapers and comments on the street, some people find all four of the finalists contrasting with the dear old Payson gallery. Let me just read you something. I read this to you before, but here's a comment about the museum. Another loss to the Portland area, construction without a soul, designed in such a way that it could be repurposed as a Neiman Marcus. But that wasn't 2023. That was 1983, and that was people talking about the Payson building, which was not universally embraced when it was new, as are most things. But and I've heard people say, "Oh, it clashes with the the Hay building, and my response is usually, have these people seen a city? A city's made up of lots of diverse, clashing things. But what is your thinking about how this new building will
fit in? I appreciate the question, and everyone, I think, when you're talking about a new museum, this is something that we're, LDM is 1910, Payson is 82, which is now 40 years old.
Yeah.
Museums are things that become part of communities for a very long time, and so when you think about building a museum, one thing I've learned from other folks in this process is you don't necessarily want to look back at what's just happened in the past 20 years, because you're actually building a building for another generation. The generation that's building this building can't reflect on our nostalgic notion of when we were 10-year-olds and we went to a museum and what did we like. I think museums traditionally have been going back. There's people in a room and they remember what they loved about museums and they try to build that museum. We are thinking about a museum that's building for the future generation. We want to build flexibility into this space so that the next generation or the following generation may think that some of the spaces we're utilizing in this building need to be used for something different. The Payson building, the LDM are very fixed. There's not much you can do but what they were intended to do, which is to show art. We think there's opportunities with our new building to be more flexible about what the future may bring. We also feel strongly that yes, it's the Portland Museum of Art, but the Portland Museum of Art represents the entire state of Maine and serves the entire northern New England community. And what could be more about this community than wood? And if there's an opportunity to use natural resources located here in Maine, and then use this building as a beacon for the possibility of mass timber and harvesting sustainable wood, and then creating a manufacturing base which creates jobs in which we can become an icon for the future. Right now, some of the mass timber or the CLT, cross-laminated timber that comes into the state, if you're going to be a LEED building, you get a better rating if you ship the wood from Austria, because they're the best at this, and parts of Canada.
So even the transportation costs?
Even the transportation costs means your LEED's number could be lower. And we could be harvesting wood in Maine, but we may have to ship it out to add value so that it could be used in our building. The buildings that are being done here, they're finding ways, they're not very large buildings right now, so they can find ways to manufacture some of this here, but it's not on the scale that we're talking about. It would be horrible to think that we're harvesting wood sustainably in Maine and then shipping it out to be then adding value and then going to another. Why don't we hold that business here, and why don't we let this building become an icon for a great future of Maine's economy? Museums they're about people and they're about art and bringing people together, but how can this museum serve a role that museums didn't? And that's what our listening session said, become a center of the community, and we think this is how you can do it.
Great.
Sorry, I get very excited.
No, obviously.
I really do. I think this is, museums are not thinking about how do museums actually function as an advocate for dealing with the climate crisis.
And so, as I understand it, the new wing, the new building is about $45 million of the total $100 million proposed unification. What is in this package, or how will Lever impact the other buildings in your campus?
It's a great question. I mean, part of the brief was this unification. It was very interesting that all four of the teams wanted to make the center of the museum on High Street,
right.
And that the David Shaw's Sculpture Park would be where you entered the museum. It's interesting that they thought with our campus, if you enter from the middle of the campus, you have more of an experience to walk to all the buildings versus entering from Congress Square, where you kind of open a front door and you go all the way to the back. They still want to have most of them at entrance on Congress Square, which is essential, but that over time, we think people will meet each other, hang out in front of the building in the Sculpture Park, and go into the building and come out. and that it's going to become a more natural area for people to go into the museum, and will centralize the campus. So it was a pretty interesting concept.
Oh, yeah.
We hadn't thought about it, and all of them said, there's a fence there, take the fence down, make it more open.
Well, listen, thank you very much, Mark Bessire, Director of the Portland Museum of Art, for coming and talking about exciting developments. Also, would like to thank Dino Raymond from the Portland Media Center for producing tonight's program, and Todd Glacy for running the camera. And also would like to thank all of you for taking the time to watch Portland Rising, created by the Portland Phoenix. Thank you very much.